I hope you all have your seatbelts fastened because you're about to have your paradigm shifted a little bit here. And basically, this all has the potential to really change, your thinking and your health forever. And this ain't your mama's nutrition lecture, but it should have been. A good 30 years ago, I realized that I could have a really profound influence over the way I felt and the way I functioned by changing my nutrition. And I never really forgot the power of that realization. But it's only really become more real to me over time. More importantly, I've seen the impact that this can have on hundreds of people, not just my clients that I've worked with over the last 15 years or more, but also just hundreds of people that I get emails from every day. In fact, I've been quite unprepared really for the sort of feedback that I've gotten. But essentially, all of us see the world through a lens. That is basically our biochemistry, our hormones, our neurotransmitters, and to the degree to which we allow ourselves to be dependent on it, our blood sugar. And this is basically what colors our perceptions. But by applying the dietary principles of our ancestors, that our ancestors followed instinctively, we have the capacity to clear this lens and see the world with a clarity and sort of a foundational balance. Of course, the subtitle of my book is Beyond the Paleo Diet for Total Health and a Longer Life. By modifying these foundational principles, we really have, by modifying these foundational principles, by applying them, by applying some of the newest principles in longevity science, for instance, and by modifying them to face the challenges of the modern world in which we live in, we now have the ability to not just simply see the world around us more clearly, but to actually transform it and radically transform it. And this is what I've come halfway around the world to talk with you about tonight, and also to spend the next couple of weekends talking about, through Nourishing Australia and these different venues. So I'm very, very excited to be here tonight. Now, where we are going with this, basically here we're going to be venturing outside the box. That's confined us to a certain way of thinking about what constitutes a healthy diet that has been designed to basically advance the interests of profit instead of health. And around the world, there's this new spark of consciousness that we see happening in recognition of our own collective power, right? And it's been called the Occupy movement. And it's been happening in every city in the United States. I don't know whether you're seeing it yet in Australia, but I'm here to say that there's nothing more important than owning and occupying your own primal body and mind. Because without our health, we have absolutely nothing, and we can never possibly be free. We're vulnerable and we're malleable. And the ultimate tyranny is the deterioration of our food supply in the name of profit, in my mind. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the promise of a healthier future by taking a look at our evolutionary past. So, the paleo perspective. This is a starting place in my book about all of this. And to my mind, again, we need to take a look at what the selective pressures were that shaped our physiology and our nutritional requirements over the last 100,000 or so generations, about 2.6 million years, to understand what it is that we need to be doing now, at least in principle, as a starting place to reclaim, the sort of primal health that is our birthright. So 99.99% of our genetic makeup was actually formed before the birth of agriculture. And we've only changed genetically maybe 0.005% since then. So really all of us, regardless of our ethnic backgrounds, regardless of our ideologies, we're all of us hunter-gatherers, fundamentally, first and foremost. And to me, this has to be an essential starting place in establishing sort of a healthy nutritional base. But I also, in my view, I think we need to go a little bit beyond that, but it has to start here. So here's the mantra that I get from people, but gee, didn't we only live 30 years in those days? Well, no. when anthropologists talk about the average age of death in our primitive ancestors, in our Paleolithic ancestors, they're talking about averages. This is also factoring in infant mortality, which was considerable in those days. The primary cause of death was really accident and infection. And if you were able to kind of get around all that and survive obviously the infant mortality thing, you really stood a chance of living every bit as long a life as we do today, only really without the sort of the degenerative conditions that so many people suffer. And of course, life back in those days was just a little more hazardous. And so we have to consider that too. To some degree, what we're actually comparing is the relative hostility of our two environments. But then again, nowadays you don't have to be over 30 to be in serious trouble. And we're seeing the diseases of, degenerative diseases and all kinds of things, autoimmune diseases, occurring in younger and younger and younger individuals. We're seeing plaquing in arteries in babies. We have all of this supposed marvelous technology, but we've lost ourselves along the way, and we've certainly lost some of the most foundationally important principles that we need in order to live, I think, a full and authentic life. So here's our first hint. Fundamentally, we are creatures of the Ice Age. And there's something called the Milankovitch Cycle. Now, this is just the last 415,000 years. And what this basically represents are climatic shifts that have occurred over just the last 415,000 years. These are climatic cycles. And what we're seeing here is basically what global temperatures have been. And this line of demarcation is these little tiny blips that we see here and, above this line are time periods in the last 415,000 years that have been actually relatively temperate, where you could wander around in a loincloth with a spear and feel relatively comfortable most places in the world. And these, of course, temperatures are essentially average temperatures. So what we're talking about is not the whole planet being that same temperature, but that it being warmer in some places and colder in the others, and that this is the way it averages out. But we've only spent a small percentage of this time actually in relatively temperate conditions above averages of 0 degrees centigrade. And we've actually spent the vast majority of our history with averages considerably below that. Meaning, with ice ages, of course, around here, for instance, closer to the equator, it would have been obviously more temperate. But what you're looking at is, with ice ages, is not just snow and cold. You're talking about extremes, climatic extremes. You're talking about drought and wildfires. And during the last ice age, while most of North America and extreme South America were locked in snow and ice, Africa was being ripped apart by drought and wildfires. You're talking about tremendous volcanic activity. We're talking about extremes of flooding and extremes of extreme storms. And we're also talking about shorter growing seasons and probably much more difficult conditions to survive. And I only illustrate this to sort of to show you in part that we've had an extremely climatically variable and extreme history. And by the way, all of human civilization, everything that we know as our history, has actually occurred in this little piece right here. So, but we've been evolving as hominids, we've been evolving for 2.6 million years, long ways back. So this is just a tiny little chunk of that time. And so all of agriculture has occurred in this little tiny blip right here. So what does all this mean? For maybe all but 10% of the last 500,000 years alone, in fact, for the last 2.6 million years, we've been in something called the Quaternary Period, which is the Ice Age, which we're still actually in. And it's consisted of periods of glacial advance and glacial retreat, roughly 11,500 years apart, with smaller cycles and longer cycles in there, all of it basically being driven by the sun, by solar cycles. So that the cold glacial periods have always been much longer than the warm interglacial periods. And physiologically, we became identical to modern humans roughly 200,000 years ago during one of these colder periods. So our physiology is intricately adapted to these conditions, to these extreme conditions, and it has to be, or we simply wouldn't be here. So understanding this, at least in my mind, is somewhat key to unlocking an understanding of our most basic nutritional requirements. So part of the reason that my book says Beyond the Paleo Diet is that I think we need to consider some other factors, the DNA and epigenetics, factors like, attitude and belief come into play, and certainly, the impact of modern dietary and environmental stress, and also modern day science. And I took a special interest in also modern longevity science, which has some very, very interesting ways, offers some very interesting ways of modifying these principles in a way that can allow us to better optimize what has been the most optimal human diet. So here's what we do with neo-Paleolithic grocery shopping. Much simpler than what we see in the grocery stores today. No center aisles, no processed foods, just very, very basic, simple, whole, recognizable foods. And the hunter-gatherer diet basically consisted of very, very high-quality animal protein and fat, with a variety of mostly fibrous plant foods. And I go into detail as to why it was mostly fibrous plant foods as opposed to starchy in my book. And also a few nuts and seeds as they were seasonally available, and a little bit of fruit and berries as they were seasonally available. Plant foods would have required extremely careful selection and preparation because wild plant foods have quite a few more antinutrients, quite a few more toxic compounds than the vegetables that we enjoy today, that we've cultivated and genetically modified, not GMO-wise, but that we've sort of bred a lot of the anti-nutrients out of the vegetables that we consume today. A lot of them, not all of them, but in the good old days, I don't know how many of you have ever taken a wild edible plant class. I have a real interest in all these kinds of things, wilderness survival and all of that. You go around looking at these plants in the woods and which ones are edible, and you realize, okay, now this you're only supposed to eat a tiny little bit of, this you really have to cook thoroughly, this is only good during certain times of the year, et cetera, and it's very labor intensive, and you really have to know kind of what you're doing so as not to get too much of anything or make yourself sick. Some of these compounds will kill you, some just complicate your life a little bit for a while. At any rate, but throughout most of our evolutionary history, this diet included very, very little starch or sugar. And we would have had really very much a very low carbohydrate, particularly sugar and starch content diet. And we would have drunk very little other than, fresh, pure, clean water, which is the one thing that we're actually designed to drink. I'm sure we probably made herbal teas and things like that, but water would have been our primary fluid. So grass-fed meat, of course, today, the way we replicate this, because of course who has time to hunt and gather anymore, and for that matter, it's woolly mammoth steaks are hard to find. So what we have today to most closely replicate this sort of hunter-gatherer diet is grass-fed meat, basically pastured meats. And it's most similar to the wild game our ancestors hunted, rather. And omega-3s in this beef fed in grass is very, very high, and it's loaded with a lot of other minerals and things like conjugated linolenic acid, which has anti-cancer properties and reduce the risk of also things like diabetes and a number of immune disorders. It's also good for reducing incidence of obesity. It's good stuff. And of course, this includes things like pastured poultry and wild-caught fish, which should always be selected over farmed fish, which can be full of all kinds of pesticides and unknowable things. To say nothing of the fact that they tend to endanger the wild populations. Just the very active aqua farming tends to diminish the health of wild populations of fish. And one other reason why eating organic produce matters is that, statistically now, our soils are just so depleted globally. And in the States, we've got it, really the worst. In North America, our soils are depleted. The mineral content is depleted by about 85%. You guys have actually got it about the best. You've only been depleted 55%. But organic produce, something grown in rich soils, non-depleted, relatively non-depleted soils. Even organic soil isn't what it used to be. So roles of dietary carbohydrates and fats in our bodies, just to touch upon this, because it's a very big deal. We're told that we're supposed to be eating basically a carbohydrate-based diet, so we might as well know what they do, right? Glucose, which is the most, sort of fundamental component in a manner of speaking of utilizable carbohydrate, is, we're told, of course, is supposed to fuel everything in our bodies, and that can be true. It basically serves as a turbocharged source of quick mental, physical, and anaerobic energy. It's basically like rocket fuel in our systems. Now, carbohydrates themselves overall really comprise only about 2% of our physical makeup. So in other words, our structural makeup, I should say. Where fats and proteins actually make up quite a bit more of our structure. Really, carbohydrates make up maybe 2% of our structure. Most of that is in the form of connective tissue. And we can manufacture every last bit of that from a combination of proteins and fats in the diet. We don't actually have to consume any carbohydrates in order to replenish and rebuild that structure. Fiber, of course, basically forms bulk. It can bind excess hormones for elimination. It also can provide some nutrients for healthy gastrointestinal flora, assuming that you have any healthy gastrointestinal flora, which is a challenge. So what are carbohydrates? Well, these are the sugar and starch containing carbohydrates that I will be kind of referring to in a disparaging sort of way throughout the rest of the presentation. But these are the ones, and yes, milk is mostly a carbohydrate-based food. The more whole the milk is, the lower the carbohydrate content by virtue of fat displacing it. But if you remove all the fat from milk, you have a very, very high carbohydrate food. But at any rate, all of this stuff, and yes, and even including the natural sweeteners like honey and, God forbid, agave, which is actually just about as bad as high fructose corn syrup. In some ways, I know it's the darling of the natural food industry, but it's really it's basically an industrial byproduct of tequila manufacturing. Not that there's anything wrong with tequila, but So, and the fibrous vegetables and greens, which we give the big thumbs up to, are what we're sort of embracing here. These are also carbohydrates, but they're basically very high in fiber, very low in utilizable carbohydrate, and therefore, but they're also extremely high in phytonutrients and antioxidants, which in my mind are probably more important to us now than they ever have been before in our evolutionary past, just by virtue of the kind of environment that we're trying to endure. And of course, a few berries. And where berries are great is most fruit today is bred for not its nutritional content, but its sweetness. But berries actually do contain a really rich amount of antioxidants, of phytonutrients, anthocyanins, things that can have really offer some really profound benefits. So I don't have too big a quarrel with berries. A handful of blueberries a day or something isn't going to unravel anybody, and they do have some benefits. So some fun facts about carbohydrates. Of all the major macronutrients, proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, the only one for which there really is no human dietary and any physiological human dietary requirement is carbohydrates. Of course, this is the base of the food pyramid, what we're supposed to be basing our diet on, but there really is no true physiological requirement for carbohydrates dietarily. We can manufacture all the glucose we need from a combination of protein and fat in the diet. And in fact, the only human tissue that has to have glucose, that must have glucose at all times in order to do well, in order to survive, are our red blood cells. They feed anaerobically so that they can basically spare their precious cargo, which is oxygen. But everything else in the human body can actually run beautifully on something called ketones, which are the energy units of fat. But, so all starchy carbohydrates are ultimately sugar once they hit your bloodstream. So I see basically all of these utilizable carbohydrates as ultimately sugar once they hit your bloodstream. And the thing about that is that, sugars are, they're damaging. They attract free radical activity. They cause something called glycation, which is a process by which sugars will combine with proteins and fats in your bloodstream and cause them to become sticky and misshapen in all of your tissues, actually, and cause them to gradually malfunction. And it's a major part of how we age. This is why things start to kind of break down over time and not work as well. It's a process called glycation. And when sugars combine with these things, they form what they call AGEs, appropriately enough, advanced glycosylation end products. and they create quite a bit of inflammation in the body. So the human body is really obsessed with maintaining the lowest level of blood sugar, essential for any given thing, and probably, you know, also largely due to sugar's damaging effects. But really, only in modern times have we developed the need to sort of, or have we ever created an emergency need to have to lower blood sugar through the overconsumption of sugar and starch, and we're extremely poorly adapted to this modern need. Fats and not sugar are really meant to be our primary form of fuel and energy, you know, everyday energy. And a diet excessively high in carbohydrates will cause the body and the brain to develop a natural dependence on carbohydrates for that primary source of fuel. You keep filling yourself with carbohydrates, the body starts to expect that as its primary source of fuel. It makes the metabolic adaptation, and now you're basically a sugar burner, as I call it. But as creatures of the Ice Age, we're really designed to use ketones and not glucose as our primary source of fuel, particularly our brains. And our brain, of course, yes, this means the brain too, because we're told that this is a really common myth. We're told by doctors and nutritionists, whatever, your brain has to have glucose. At all times, your brain must have glucose. Well, your brain must have access to glucose just in case there's an emergency. But that statement is really only conditionally true. Your brain only has to have glucose if your brain has metabolically adapted itself to depending on glucose as its primary source of fuel. But that's not your brain's only choice. And the nature would never have been so stupid as to make us full-time dependent on sugar as that primary source of fuel, something so volatile, something so unreliable, something so damaging. And the brain doesn't actually respond that much to insulin, and so it's extremely vulnerable to the kind of damage that, the kind of glycating damage that sugar can generate. And the brain and the nervous system are particularly vulnerable to what kind of damage that sugar can do. But ketones, on the other hand, you know, provide a much more steady, consistent, reliable, and a very abundant source of fuel, very even burning, for our brains and also all of our other organs to depend upon. Now, you know, the brain is also our most expensive organ, by the way, with respect to metabolic needs in the body. It occupies maybe 2 to 5% of our total mass, and some politicians maybe just 0.5%, but you know, you get the general idea. But it actually utilizes a good 30% or so of our total energy requirement. This is a really expensive organ in here, and to meet its, you know, considerable energy demands. So fat really provides, of course, more calories per gram than carbohydrates on average of any available energy source. So it's really by far the best source of fuel. Now, the brain can and does use glucose, especially when the person consumes a diet that's dominated by carbohydrates or in an emergency. But glucose is nowhere near as essential to day-to-day functioning of the brain as it is, you know, as it is commonly presented or believed. So, why is this good news? Basically, because ketones are really abundant, they're stable, they're a steady source of fuel even in the absence of regular meals. So brain cells, again, they don't respond that much to insulin, and so the, you know, so ketones, so in other words, glucose is a lot more damaging, but ketones are not. The brain just simply thrives on them. And the other reason that this is good news is that you can also say, if you're dependent on fat instead of sugar, bye-bye sugar blues. So anyway, we're all metabolically adapted to being one of two things. We're either a fat burner or a sugar burner, right? So a diet that's dominated by carbohydrates is going to generate an adaptation to being primarily dependent on glucose for that unnatural, or rather for that primary source of fuel, which is a rather unnatural state for us to be in. So if we're adapted to that, we're going to automatically be craving the very thing that we're dependent upon. And this is the primary reason why people will crave carbohydrates, some more than others. So if we're looking at carbohydrates and fats just strictly from the standpoint of the energy that they provide us, I like to use a little analogy. We can look upon carbohydrates as fundamentally basically being kindling on our metabolic fires. Now, I was raised in Minnesota, which some of you may have heard of. It's rather cold. And, you know, so wood stove analogies work well for me. And So if you had to heat your house with nothing but, with a wood stove, and all you had to heat with that wood stove was kindling, well, you could do it. But with respect to the carbohydrates, you can kind of look upon your whole grains and your beans and your brown rice and things like that as basically being the equivalent, what they call the complex carbs that we're all supposed to eat the most of. These are the equivalent of basically being twigs on the metabolic fire, right? Your potatoes and your white rice and your pasta and things like that are basically paper on the metabolic fire. Now, alcohol, on the other hand, is basically the equivalent of putting lighter fluid or gasoline on that fire.
Even organic wine?
Yeah, and organic wine. Yeah, there we go. Well, we won't make any disparaging remarks about that tonight. It's good stuff. So at any rate, so here we are with our little wood stove and our little pile of kindling. If we had to heat our home with nothing but this, we could certainly do it. We would have this little stool here pulled right up to the very front of this with the doors open, and we'd be sitting there reaching for handfuls of twigs and paper and squirting a little lighter fluid on there, and we'd pretty much be there all day long. We'd have a nice hot fire going, but we would be constantly preoccupied with where that next handful of fuel was coming from. And God forbid we should have to take a break and go use the bathroom or go do something else or whatever, and then we come back and, oh my God, the fire's going out. Where's the quickest thing that's going to ignite this? And then you're loading it up again, you're piling everything in there that you can, and then you're just sort of back to just sort of throwing regular handfuls in. And it would get to be a little bit tedious. You'd be getting up in the middle of the night to, stoke the fire. And you wouldn't have much of a life outside of that. Really, there would be a constant preoccupation with maintaining that sort of, maintaining the fire. So what's the result, again, of fueling yourself this way? It's a constant preoccupation with carbohydrate-based foods and snacking. And this is the reason why that conventional nutritionists will tell you, always eat a big breakfast, never skip meals, eat every 2 hours, yada, yada, yada. Because if you're feeding yourself kindling, well then by golly, you had better keep piling it in there. But this is what a carbohydrate-based diet looks like in the animal kingdom. If you happen to have 4 stomachs, which most of us don't, or you happen to have a bacterially based digestion, as many herbivores, or as all herbivores do actually, what do you see? You see their faces are in the bushes and in the grass, and they're basically preoccupied with eating constantly to meet those metabolic demands on that type of a diet. I personally have better things to do, but you can do it. You can sure do it. But who benefits when we're doing all this? Just to have a little bit of an Alex Jones moment. Think in terms of who would profit from the idea of us all basically being entirely dependent upon a carbohydrate-based diet. Well, we have, of course, the food industry. We have big agribusiness. Certainly the pharmaceutical industry isn't doing too bad, and even the petroleum industry, of which big agribusiness is entirely dependent upon. I'm sure undertakers are making a killing at this too. But it's not necessarily us that's benefiting. So what's the alternative? Well, back to the fire. Oh my gosh, now we have logs to put on the fire. So basically this is instead of throwing kindling constantly, now you take a nice big fat log and throw that on the fire, and what do you know, you have a life. Suddenly now you can go off and you can run errands and you can do different things, and you come back later and you take a look and it's, oh, look, the fire's burning a little bit down, throw another log on the fire, and you can go to bed and you can wake up in the morning after sleeping the whole night through and toss another log on the fire and go about your business. This is, metabolically adapting yourself to fat burning as opposed to sugar burning is probably the single most liberating thing I certainly have ever done for my own physiological makeup. It's unbelievably freeing that food, eating, becomes more of a choice than a constant preoccupation and necessity. And you're able to, you're freer also to make better choices because the cravings kind of aren't there. And so I can have something like a duck egg cooked in a little ghee or something at 6 in the morning, and if I haven't eaten by 2 in the afternoon, I might be getting hungry, but I'm not all brain fogged and feeling jittery or irritable. I don't have snakes growing out of my hair. I'm not super fatigued and that sort of a thing. I'm just a little hungry, which is the way it's supposed to be. And then I'll eat something, and then I'm not hungry anymore, and that's the way it's supposed to be. So again, fat, it burns aerobically. It burns in a much more prolonged and sustained manner. It can be stored a lot more efficiently and drawn upon as energy from reserves for a much longer period of time. Even the slenderest person in this room has enough residual body fat to be able to live for a month if you needed to without having to replenish. I'm not saying that that's something that everybody should go out and do or that anyone would enjoy, but doesn't it make sense that fat would have been selectively our primary source of fuel throughout, we would have been physiologically designed to depend on something like that. It certainly would have allowed us to live in much more variable conditions with variable access to food. And again, it needs a lot less frequent replenishment, and we can sort of, again, look at it metaphorically as being a log on that metabolic fire. So moving on to healthy whole grains, what about those complex carbs? Well, I just want to kind of touch upon the subject of gluten. This is something that I've taken a lot more of an interest in, not just simply because I happen to have that issue, but because I'm running into it in virtually everybody that walks into my office. Turns out it's a heck of a lot more prevalent than anybody ever suspected, and gluten sensitivity is a huge, huge issue. So here's a study published in 2009. I swear I'm not going to have a lot of text-heavy slides here. But in the peer-reviewed journal Gastroenterology, it compared 10,000 available blood samples from individuals 50 years ago to 10,000 people today and found that there has been a 400% increase in the incidence of full-blown celiac disease, which is defined by conventional medicine as total villous atrophy of the small intestine. And of course, our small intestines are filled with something that looks a little bit like shag carpeting, and these little villi are these little finger-like projections that sort of look like shags on the shag carpeting are actually increased surface area that allow for the absorption of a lot of nutrients in our diet. And if we were to unfold it or whatever, it would spread out to something like the size of a football field. So it adds a tremendous amount of surface area. And what happens in celiac disease is that there's this gradual erosion of the shag carpeting all the way down to Berber. And when you have that, you have severe malabsorption. So in celiac disease, you're really only diagnosable with a condition if this has totally become this. And so they do the intestinal biopsy, and it looks like this. The doctor says, you're fine, go home, have some bread. And that's the standard of diagnosis. So it's a very underdiagnosed condition, even though it's the #1 autoimmune disease in the world. And it's the equivalent of saying you don't have heart disease until you've been diagnosed with a heart attack. It's a little bit crazy. But this is sort of the sad state of the diagnostic criteria. But it's really only the tip of the iceberg. Celiac disease is a form of gluten sensitivity, but not all gluten sensitivity is celiac disease. Celiac disease itself occupies maybe this, where all of gluten sensitivity is down here. And even within the standard of celiac, they call it the celiac iceberg, this is how much is diagnosed. Then you have people with the classic presentations, then you have atypical presentations, then you have silent and asymptomatic, and then you have genetic predisposition. And Dr. Kenneth Fine, who's a medical gastroenterologist and a pioneer in the field, actually found through widespread testing that 1 in 3 Americans, and this was actually quite a number of years ago, actually, and this was with the testing that he had available at the time. There's much better testing available now. But way back when, he found that 1 in 3 Americans actually has gluten intolerance, and that 8 in 10 are actually genetically predisposed to gluten intolerance. It can present with inflammation in the joint, skin, respiratory tract, and brain. 8 out of 10 celiac patients actually don't have any gastrointestinal symptoms at all. And in fact, it may be primarily and at times exclusively a neurological disease. But I digress. So ponder this. Only about an estimated 1% of everyone suffering gluten sensitivity or celiac disease is ever diagnosed. And this? Food sensitivity reactions are also going to impact your blood sugar and insulin, even if you're eating a very low carbohydrate diet. So I'll have somebody who's eating a very low carbohydrate diet, but their blood sugar is still through the roof, and food sensitivity issues are the next most logical suspect. And living with this can be miserable at best. And also remember, being mostly gluten-free is a little bit like saying, I'm just a little bit pregnant, just a tiny little bit. You either are or you're not. And this is supposed to be the basis of the food pyramid? Well, hint, pyramids are tombs. So what about the stuff that we're told to avoid, though, in that same food pyramid? Well, let's talk a little bit here about dietary fat. So here's a fact. Fats are really the most generalized, misunderstood component of the diet, and they're really the most unjustly maligned. Fats are not just one thing. Fats are many things. There's so many different compounds, and they do different things in the body. There are different types of saturated fats that act completely differently in the human body. Different types of polyunsaturated fat, different types of omega-3s, several different types of omega-6s. But all natural fats have their rightful place in the human body. And what are the roles of fats? They make up about 80% of the human brain. About half of actually the fat in the human brain is actually saturated, by the way. And about a quarter of the fat in the human brain is something called DHA. It's one of the omega-3s and critical for our cognitive functioning. They're essential for absorption of many nutrients, essential for the formation of most of our hormones, for the structure and healthy functioning of our cell membranes, and healthy functioning of our gallbladders. The primary fuel for the muscles, including the human heart, essential for healthy immune function. I mean, it goes on and on. Fats are really, really important for a wide variety of things. Fats are not just about energy. Energy is a small component of what fats actually do in the body. And when we eat fat, most of what we eat actually first goes to structure, and only what is excess ultimately gets stored as energy. So what are the consequences of a low-fat diet? Well, some of the signs and symptoms: musculoskeletal issues, endocrine issues, cardiovascular issues, immune issues, allergies and skin problems, gallbladder problems, depression, anxiety, mood swings, inflammatory issues, attention disorders, cognitive dysfunction, poor memory, and enhanced neurological instability. Nothing more stabilizing to the brain than dietary fat. Nothing more destabilizing than sugar and starch. So again, here's an evolutionary consideration. We are creatures of the Ice Age, and to us, and of the wild, fat to our primal physiology essentially means survival. And by restricting or eliminating dietary fat intake, the body will have its way. The body's just simply going to become more efficient at manufacturing and storing fat from other things in the diet, namely carbohydrates. In fact, most of what people have as unwanted body fat is not the result of dietary fat, but rather the result of excess dietary carbohydrate, excess dietary sugar and starch. But fats have such diverse roles to play in our structure and physiology that it's really important that we get natural fat from as big a variety of sources as we possibly can. We don't just want to rely on what our body is going to manufacture from carbohydrates, which is mostly palmitic acid. There are many, many, many more roles for fat to play, and many more sources of fat that are important to get. So where does all this anti-saturated fat agenda and dietary heart hypothesis come from? Well, this is actually a quote by Dr. George Mann, who is formerly with the Framingham Project, the most famous heart research project in the world. And he said, I quote, "The diet heart hypothesis that suggests that high intake of fat and cholesterol causes heart disease has been repeatedly shown to be wrong, and yet for complicated reasons of pride, profit, and prejudice, the hypothesis continues to be exploited by scientists, fundraising enterprises, food companies, and even governmental agencies. The public is being deceived by the greatest health scam of the century." And then one of his cohorts, Dr. William Costelli, who was the director of the Framingham study, stated, "In Framingham, Massachusetts, the more saturated fat one ate, the more cholesterol one ate, the more calories one ate, the lower people's serum cholesterol. We found that people who ate the most cholesterol, ate the most saturated fat, ate the most calories, weighed the least, and were the most physically active." So where on earth did this idea about fats being bad for us ever even come from?
If you could pack all of human history into 1 year, we've only been farming and eating grain since about yesterday, which is when we became shorter and fatter. We only started consuming processed vegetable oils about 10 minutes ago, which is when heart disease became our #1 killer. So after examining all this human history, the experts came to the obvious conclusion: we need to eat a lot more of these. And so they convinced us that human health depends on foods we didn't eat for more than 99% of our entire existence. How did this happen? 1950s, a biochemist named Ansel Keys published a study that compared heart disease and fat consumption in a half-dozen countries. The more fat, the more heart disease. The trend line was unmistakable. Just one little problem. Keys left out countries where people eat a lot of fat but have very little heart disease, like Holland and Norway. He also left out countries where people don't eat much fat but do have a lot of heart disease, like Chile. In fact, Keys had reliable data from 22 countries, and the results were all over the place. But you can't make a big splash in the scientific community with a trend line that looks like this. So Keys did what any dedicated researcher would do. He threw out the data that didn't fit and published his results. His punishment for this bit of scientific chicanery was to get his picture on the cover of Time magazine. Keys became known as the father of the lipid hypothesis, which says that eating saturated fat raises the cholesterol in your blood, and high cholesterol in your blood clogs your arteries and causes heart disease.
The hypothesis that when you eat high fat, that then that produces high cholesterol, and the cholesterol produces heart disease, is wrong in every one of those links.
This whole idea that dietary fat causes cholesterol problems is sort of a myth. The whole idea that cholesterol problems lead to heart disease is a myth.
The theory is completely and totally wrong. It was a theory that was made out of whole cloth and then pushed.
The term artery clogging saturated fat, it's as though it's all one word.
It's become part of the zeitgeist. Everybody knows saturated fat is bad for you, but when you get back and you start looking at the medical literature and you root back through to find out where this whole idea came from, it's bogus.
This is actually from a documentary by my friend Tom Naughton called Fathead. And I urge everybody to go out and fast forward it to part 2, to the second half of it, which is I think is completely brilliant. Very, very funny guy. So, the majority of the fat in the human body is saturated. Why? For heaven's sake. Because we aren't refrigerated. With all the talk about antioxidants being, so great about sort of protecting us from things, one of the things that gets overlooked is the fact that saturated fat, by virtue of its very nature, is resistant to oxidation. And so it's saturated fats play a very, very important role in helping to preserve some of the very delicate polyunsaturated fats in our body and keeping us sort of stable at room temperature, as it were. Just a fun point I wanted to make. So here's the thought for the day. No diet, the quote, by the way, no diet will remove all of the fat from your body because the brain is entirely fat. Without a brain, you might look good, but all you could do is run for public office. George Bernard Shaw. So, cholesterol. Here's this great Sidney Harris cartoon here. It says, it appears that our diet is almost 100% cholesterol. This appears to be very, very, very bad. Well, is it? What are the roles of cholesterol in our body? This evil cholesterol that we're all supposed to be so wary of. It's an essential building block of every single steroid hormone that we have. We need it for the health of our cell membranes. We need it for the functioning of our nervous system, of our nerve sheaths, the white matter of our brain and adrenal glands. We need it for brain function and development. We need it for normal cognitive functioning. It's incredibly important to the functioning of the brain. It's part of every single cell membrane, and it helps to maintain cellular integrity and regulate cellular permeability. It helps keep moods level by stabilizing neurotransmitters. And also very, very important for helping to maintain a healthy immune system. Some more fun facts, by the way. We manufacture up to 2,000 milligrams of cholesterol every single day. Several times the amounts found in our diets. You maybe get 60 milligrams out of an egg. At any given time, we got a baby 150,000 milligrams of cholesterol circulating our entire bodies. And dietary cholesterol and serum cholesterol have nothing whatever to do with one another. You can imagine with that much cholesterol circulating in our bodies, how much impact 60 milligrams worth in an egg or whatever would actually have. It's almost negligible. Significant amounts of cholesterol have always existed in the human diet. And in fact, it's so important that if we're not eating cholesterol, the body considers this a form of a small emergency, and the liver steps up the production of this enzyme called HMG-CoA reductase. And HMG-CoA reductase starts to manufacture more cholesterol from carbohydrates in the diet. And so the drug manufacturers, not really wanting to let you in on that, understand very well how this works, and have created statin drugs as a way of basically dampening the HMG-CoA reductase so that you're not manufacturing so much of this from carbohydrates in your diet. What it also does, though, is it dampens the production, because the same pathway that creates the cholesterol also creates something called coenzyme Q10, which may be the single most important nutrient for the human heart. And it's critical to the production of energy in every single cell. And so, so one of the horrid side effects, of course, is of statins can be actually a weakening of the heart and other muscles, and as well as damage to cognitive functioning. But you could, of course, just cut back on the carbs and just get enough natural cholesterol in your diet, and everything would be hunky-dory. But why do that when you can pop a pill? So, but basically, cholesterol is our body's version of duct tape, okay? It runs around basically patching up lesions, helping to make hormones, and doing various things. It has a lot of different roles to play in the body. And so when you see elevations of cholesterol in somebody's blood chemistry profile, what it's telling you is that there's something going on for which cholesterol is needed. And trying to take a drug to beat cholesterol back is the equivalent of blaming the firemen that come to put out the fire and blaming them for the fire. Cholesterol is really no more, it's an indicator. It's a way of saying, okay, there's a reason that, cholesterol says, yeah, there's a reason that I'm here. And rather than paying attention to why it might be there, we're blaming it and attempting to dial it down somehow. And it's also sort of the equivalent of saying, oh, look, the engine light has come on my dashboard, so I'm going to fix this by unscrewing the light bulb on the engine light, and that's going to make everything better. When really it may be time to just kind of lift up the hood and take a look and actually see what that's actually doing. If your cholesterol is elevated, there are many, many things that may elevate cholesterol. If you have depressed thyroid function, I promise you're going to have elevated cholesterol. That's just a natural reaction to that. If you have some sort of inflammatory issue going on, that's going to elevate cholesterol. Some kind of chronic infection, that will elevate cholesterol. Even stress can elevate cholesterol. But also really high sugar and starch diets are also going to elevate cholesterol because of that HMG-CoA reductase thing. So many different reasons why it may go up. But again, cholesterol is no more the cause of heart disease than gray hair is the cause of old age. It's an indicator. And just simply because it may be associated with certain conditions, although really at least half of all people who get heart attacks have cholesterol that's considered perfectly acceptable by medical standards. And by the way, my father was one of them. My father, who actually was a very well-known radiologist and wrote the textbook called Cardiovascular Radiology, and was very, very proud of his low cholesterol, dropped dead of a heart attack at 81 years of age just a few years ago. So, having low cholesterol guarantees absolutely nothing. And in fact, I worry much more about people whose cholesterol is too low than too high. Many more associations with all-cause mortality, including stroke, by the way, with cholesterol that is too low. And I see it a lot with things like cancer and autoimmune disease as well. So, moral of the story here, every day you should eat something from each of the 5 basic food groups: fried blubber, broiled blubber, steamed blubber, baked blubber, and raw blubber. So what do all the longest-lived individuals in the world have in common? If there's one single known marker for long life as found in the centenarian and animal studies, it is low insulin levels, which is stated by Dr. Ron Rosedale, a hero of mine. So the moral of the story is basically this: the more we can come to depend on fat or ketones for our primary source of fuel and not sugar or glucose, by far, the longer we will live and the healthier we will be, by far. So what is it we're supposed to eat again? Well, here's the basic dietary approach. We're basically talking about avoiding sugar and starch, maybe a few, handful of berries or whatever, but really otherwise, because there is no basic human dietary requirement for carbohydrates, to me it's sort of a no-brainer. Basically, leave it out. And then eat as many fibrous, in other words, above ground vegetables and greens as you'd like, cooked, cultured, raw, Juicing greens is okay. I think it can be a really good thing. And eating a moderate amount of protein from complete, in other words, animal, fish, etc. sources. And then eat as much natural fat as you need in order to satisfy your appetite. We're not talking about drinking lard here. This is not a high-fat diet. But it ends up being a high-percentage fat diet. It's a sort of a form of modified caloric restriction, in a manner of speaking. I probably get about 70% of my calories on any given day from fat. And I get a small amount of protein, and I probably eat more vegetables than most vegetarians do. Handful of nuts here and there. But fat tends to be self-limiting because it's the one macronutrient that actually satisfies the appetite. It actually tends to be pretty self-limiting. It's, most people are not gorging on sticks of butter and things like that. You get, after a couple of bites, you're like, okay, enough. So you're never hungry. When you're a fat burner, you're never hungry. That's the great thing about it. How many of you are familiar with Francis Pottinger? Ever hear of this guy? Back in the 1930s, 1940s, he did a series of experiments with now famous experiments with cats. Wrote a book called Pottinger's Cats. And he took these groups of cats, 3 groups of cats, and he fed one group of cats basically a raw, very natural to a cat diet, raw meat diet. He took the second group of cats and he cooked all their food. And he took the third group of cats and fed them basically processed foods. And what he saw, in that initial generation of cats were, some small maybe signs of less than optimal health in the latter 2 groups. But what he found most striking was that in each subsequent generation of cats that were fed these sort of more processed or cooked diets, he saw increasingly progressive generations of these poor dietary habits really result in increasingly more vulnerable progeny. And each subsequent generation of these unhealthy dietary habits basically resulted in all kinds of birth defects and impaired resistance to disease and impaired mental and cognitive health and also impaired capacity to reproduce. And a lot of people are drawing parallels with his work. It's almost a little prophetic in a way to what we're seeing now with our epidemic levels of poor health and overwhelming rates of things like violence and attentional disorders and autism and childhood and adult behavioral problems and mental illness, fertility issues, and birth defects. And so, Pottinger's work with cats really underscored the long-term consequences generationally when we rely on a less than optimal diet, when we rely on a diet that is heavy in processed foods that are nutritionally inferior and chronically compromised. So the question then becomes, what generation of Pottinger's cat are you? We're many generations now into the influence of the food industry and the deterioration of our food supply, and now we're genetically modifying things. And in fact, every single day, new so-called foods are being introduced to us that we can't possibly genetically adapt ourselves to. And food has become this sort of nutrient-devoid source of entertainment to us rather than a source of nourishment. And so with each new generation, what we're seeing are bigger and bigger problems in people that are younger and younger and younger. And it's a very, very, very big issue. So, and this is what we're up against. We're living in a world that our ancestors couldn't have even begun to fathom. We're being challenged by things that are just sort of beyond the pale of reason. And we're also several generations into exposure of environmental toxins and abnormal stress levels and vaccines, heavy metals, and other sort of unspeakable influences. So what we're sort of left with now is a state where we really don't have any room for error anymore, in my view. I think what we need to be doing is, in a manner of speaking, there's so much in our environment that is out of our control now. A lot of it is. And in my view, I think what we need to be doing is taking control of what we can. And so I make a case for, really, we don't have the luxury of of indulging the way maybe our grandparents or great-grandparents once did. I know that I have some actually really crappy genetics. Cancer and heart disease and autoimmune diseases and mental illness and alcoholism and all kinds of things run rampant in my family tree, both sides of the family actually. And I'm the only member of my family that's never spent a night in a hospital and isn't struggling with weight issues and doesn't have some serious health problems to wrestle with. And that's not because I'm somehow graced with abnormally good genetics. It's because I have to, I work tooth and nail at it because I have to. So what are the consequences of denial? Well, you can put your head in the sand, but where does that put your backside? Just a thought to consider. So what we can control and what we have to do? Well, in my view, we have to take a keen interest in this machine, our primal bodies that we inhabit. We have to strive to understand our own inner workings as much as humanly possible. And I think we also need to apply what we know about the selective pressures over 100,000 generations that shaped our physiology to what we choose to eat. And we shouldn't just simply trust others to manage our health for us, especially where others' interests may not lie with our best interests, but instead perhaps with profit. We also have to avoid the temptation of using food as that cheap, nutrient-devoid source of entertainment, and instead make conscious and deliberate and very wise choices about what it is we choose to put inside our living matrix. I think we must do also what our ancestors did. As they had to, we have to adapt. And we're also forced to take certain compensatory steps that our ancestors didn't necessarily need to take. One of the first orders of business in this adaptation is to compensate as much as possible for the bombardment of this toxic oxidative onslaught from our environment. So taking steps to just regularly sort of detoxify our systems and eat foods that are fairly detoxifying, I think is really, really important. And as such, I think our need for antioxidants has never been greater, and non-starchy plant foods are probably more important to us now than they ever have been in the past. I think we must really try to avoid irradiated or chemically treated and genetically modified foods as much as we possibly can. We need to support our local farmers, these people that are working incredibly hard trying to do the right thing. They're raising their food ethically and responsibly and sustainably, and these are the people I want to give my money to. We need to get our meat and fish from really the most natural and least adulterated sources possible, and I think this should really be a high priority. We need to vote with our dollars. Really, that's the only kind of voting in my mind that really, that sends a message anymore. Dietary supplements, I think, also have somewhat of a role to play in supplying us with concentrated sources of key nutrients and antioxidants. I mean, there's so much in our soils, in our food supply that's depleted. I think that there is an inevitable need for some supplementation. I'm not a supplement huckster. I don't sell a bunch of supplements on my website and stuff like that. But I think that they have a role to play that we need to consider. And depleted nutrients in our soils and these other modern factors just, I think, to some degree make it a modern necessity. So, we actually have the capacity and key information that can allow us to live longer and healthier than we ever have before in our long evolutionary history, but only if we have the wisdom to actually use it. And that's the end.